everyone. Welcome to another workshop presented to you by the Writing Support Center. My name is Genesis. I'm one of the faculty here at the Writing Support Center. And today we're going to be talking about reading journal articles. How do we do it? What are the different parts of a journal article, etc. So an overview of today's workshop, we're going to be talking about why journal articles are challenging. Reviewing strategies to read effectively. If you've watched our other reading workshops, some of this might sound familiar to you. Using different resources on campus to help you with reading your journal articles, and we'll also have some activities throughout this workshop for you to complete. As a reminder, to get the most out of this workshop, we recommend that you complete the accompanying activity worksheet that you can find in the module. This worksheet counts as credit to your professor if you're doing this as extra credit or part of an assignment. This will demonstrate that you watched the workshop to its entirety. We also recommend for you to take your time. Feel free to pause and rewind parts that were confusing or went too fast. That's the beauty of these online workshops, is that you can really just take your time with them. So how are journal articles uniquely challenging? So it's important to understand the different parts of a journal article to better understand how to read them. That's what makes them a little more different than, say, a textbook or a worksheet or even just a website, is that there's a multitude of different parts. Sometimes you'll have key definitions. You'll usually have an abstract. And it's important to understand how these different parts work in a journal article in order to read through it more effectively and efficiently. So we're going to start off with the reflection activity. So again, the activity can be found in the accompanying worksheet in the module, so feel free to go back and do that. But I want you to think back to the times you've had to read a journal article for class. What are the first things of the article that you observe? Do you feel overwhelmed and confident in your approaches to reading the article? Do you even finish the whole article by the next class discussion? So take a couple moments to think about those previous times and jot down your reflection in the worksheet. So the different parts of a journal article. So as I mentioned, every journal article has different parts, and it's important to understand these different areas to see how they all work together to create your reading experience. So the first is the background knowledge. So in most articles, the author assumes that the readers are familiar with basic ideas, terms, and theories, and as a result, they may not explain everything. So it's important for you to ensure that you have an understanding of what these theories or basic ideas might be. And if you're not 100% sure of what they might be, or you feel like you need additional information, then it's always good to have a dictionary on hand, outside readings, or your class notes, because all of that is going to work together in order for you to understand the journal article. Vocabulary. So the vocabulary in the journal article is going to be very specific. It's going to be subject specific, and it's going to be woven into the text. Similar to the background knowledge, you might not have definitions for all of these terms. So it's important that you either have a dictionary, outside notes in order to keep track of what these different terms mean. And it's also important for you to review them because it might be helpful when you're writing your essay. Also, journal articles will have a purpose. So the author may make a claim, argument, or they're going to share an opinion. And it's important for you to have an understanding of what the purpose of the article is in order to keep in mind what it's going to be about, and for you to frame your questions and understanding around it. I usually recommend for you to search for the purpose in either the article's title or the abstract, because that's where you'll get a lot of information in a small space. To continue along, we also have the research. So most journal articles are going to be focused on the research, either the author, so the author might have conducted some sort of research project themselves, or they might be combining, making an idea or an opinion or argument based off of other folks' research, and they'll be including references to a lot of that. So it's important for you to be able to keep track who they're referencing and how many ideas they're pulling, because they're essentially making a larger idea based off of all these individual ideas from previous researchers. There's also specificity. So in some journal articles, the author may explore a very narrow, highly specific topic and perspective within a larger subject. So again, it's important for you to have an understanding of the background information in order to be able to recognize and understand these really specific topics. Formatting. So certain content may be presented in a very specific way. So depending on the subject that you're studying, whether it's humanities, the STEM sciences, sociology, etc., the way it's formatted on the page is also going to play a role with how you read and find information throughout the journal article. And then lastly, there might be a lack of visuals. So certain journal articles may only include some visual aids, or they may not include any at all. It might just be text. There may be a few or no subheadings. So we sometimes also have to adjust how we read the journal article based on those visual cues, because sometimes subheadings are really helpful for us when we're trying to skim the article. But what do we do if there are no subheadings? How do we find information that we need? And that's what we're going to discuss next. So how to read journal articles effectively. So like other readings, when you're reading, whether you're reading a textbook, whether you're reading a website article, a newspaper article, etc., there are strategies that you can use before, during, and after the reading process to get the most understanding of the article. So before you start your reading, it's important to ask questions. So this could be asking your professor questions for guiding questions or key topics to keep in mind while you're reading. Sometimes you can create your own questions. So how can this reading relate to the class? What if you're reading the abstract and the conclusion, what are some questions that you have based on the information that's provided in those areas? What information from the class can you turn into a question that can help guide your reading? It's always a lot better to have some questions for yourself as you're reading the journal article, because then that can help guide your reading. And instead of trying to interpret a large amount of information, you're tailoring the information based on these questions that you've created, or questions that are needed for the class discussion or the exam that's coming up, or the essay that you're writing. Similarly to that, convert headers into questions. So if the article that you're reading has subheadings, skim the article and find those subheadings and turn them into simple questions to guide your reading and note-taking. Again, it's about working smarter, not harder. So in what ways can we find information that we need and make it condensable and easier for us to understand? Also begin with the abstract and the conclusion. So the abstract is typically a short summary that is at the beginning of the article, and it'll include a lot of information such as the purpose of the article, the methodologies that were used, and the overall the research findings or the conclusion. So it'll include those three main things in one spot. So read that first in order to help get an understanding of what the article is going to be about. And again, that can help you create the questions that you'll need in order to have a better understanding as you read along the article. During the reading, feel free to read out of order. You don't have to read the whole article in order. And it's sometimes your class may not necessarily need you to read and understand the whole article. Sometimes you'll only, depending on your class, you may only need to understand the context, which is the background and the literature review, and the outcomes, the results and discussion. So that might be everything that your professor really wants you to focus on. So there's no need to read the whole thing. You can just read those areas and build your understanding around that. Or sometimes your professor may only really want you to focus on the methods that were used for the research. How did the author conduct their research? How did they come to their conclusions, etc.? So really think about the needs for your class and sometimes just read those sections. I also recommend to students, sometimes it's better to just be an expert on one section than it is to be an expert on the whole essay, because if you're an expert on one section, you can at least talk about that one section in your in your class discussions or in your essay. Feel free to paraphrase and condense. So after you finish a page of reading, how well can you explain key terms and ideas in your own words? Practicing turning things into your own words or taking certain ideas and putting them in your own words is going to deepen your understanding and will also bring out areas that maybe you didn't understand quite as well and might be something that you have to follow up either with your professor, talk about with a classmate, talk about with a tutor, etc. So paraphrasing and condensing is a really great way to test your own knowledge. Annotate as you read. So as you're reading, highlight and underline key areas. Be sure to make note of any questions, main ideas, unknown words, or definitions, because again, all of that is just going to help deepen your knowledge. And when you're writing your essay, instead of reviewing the whole essay for bits of information or having to reread the whole essay to remind yourself what it was about, you can just read your little notes in the margins in order to see what you were thinking and areas that you can really focus on and pull from to include in your essay. Once you finish your reading, I always recommend that you take some time away from the article and revisit at a later time and reread or skim it in order to find connections that weren't obvious in the first time around. So we're always going to find new things when we go back and reread something. And rather than the first time you read it, where you were just trying to build your understanding, this time you're going to have a base understanding and you'll be able to build on top of that as you reread it. So feel free to revisit the article at a later time. Use active study strategies. So again, paraphrase or write a short summary from memory in order to engage in deeper learning and understanding. Paraphrasing and condensing is always one of the best strategies that you can use to test your own knowledge. Explain and share concepts out loud in your own words. This could be either to yourself or with a classmate. Answer any questions that were provided. Again, you're testing your own knowledge. And then use class discussions to improve your understanding. And then if you want other ways to test your knowledge, create flashcards, concept maps, and outlines to critically think through the material. All right, so now we're gonna do a reading activity. So again, on the worksheet that's found in the accompanying module, choose a journal article from one of your classes and identify the abstract and read the headings. What is this article about? What is one question about the article that you have? And then choose the section that you find the most interesting. What are the key ideas of the section? How would you explain it to a friend or a classmate? And lastly, be sure to use your resources. So meet with a success coach or a tutor to discuss journal reading activities, attend office hours to talk with your professor, meet with a librarian to discuss additional strategies. They can also help you read through an article and build a better understanding. And check out our other reading workshops. We have a variety of reading workshops and annotation workshops for you to use in order to help you with your reading skills. So that brings us to the end of this workshop. So just to have a brief little summary, journal articles have a variety of parts that make them challenging to read. So it's important for us to have an understanding how each of these parts work in order to be able to read a journal article effectively. Use strategies before, during, and after your reading to guide your understanding. Read smarter, not harder, focus on certain sections and build your understanding on those sections because sometimes that's all we need for a class or for an essay. And use additional resources to help with your reading and understanding. So whether that's talking to a success coach, librarian, or a tutor, or reviewing other workshops provided on campus, all of that would be really helpful. So thank you so much for watching this workshop. I hope that this was very helpful for you, and we encourage you to join us next time, whether it's in person or online. Thank you.